the webinar. Thanks, Sean.
Excellent. Thank you, Lynn. Yes, welcome everybody. Good afternoon and good evening to those who are joining over here in Australia and over in New Zealand. And good morning to those who've got up rather earlier up in the Northern Hemisphere over in Europe. My name is Sean Sweeney. I'm Associate Director and Country Manager for the APEM Group here in Australia. I've been working for the APEM Group for about 13 years, most of that time supporting the offshore wind industry with marine wildlife survey data collection to provide a baseline characterization from an ornithological perspective and working on environmental impact assessments throughout that time. And I moved here to Australia back in January this year, and the group has been going from strength to strength really during that time. So I'm really pleased that so many familiar and new faces and names that I can see popping up have joined the second in our series of webinars here to support the offshore wind industry in Australia. And this second one is focused upon the challenge of offshore wind coexisting with shipping, navigation and the ports industry. And it's been delivered by our partners and APEM Group members at Nash Maritime, who are based in the UK, of which Jamie and Brock will be discussing this topic. We just go through to the next slide, please. So I'll just give you a very, very brief overview of what we'll be discussing here today. We'll do some welcomes and introductions, also have an acknowledgement of country shortly, but I'll respect to just pause and wait for that until more people have arrived. We'll give you just a very, very brief overview of the APEM Group for those of you who are not familiar with what we do and who we are and where we're based and some of the services that we provide our clients. We'll then move over to Jamie and Brock and the panel to see a presentation of the navigational risk assessment tools that they use and the services that they've been providing globally and how that can support the industry of the offshore wind, expansion of offshore wind here in Australia. And then we'll have a panel discussion then, open up from questions. So it's important to realize that you can also add these questions in. There will be a Q&A little box probably at the top of your Teams screens that you can then type in your own questions. So please do, and you can type them in throughout whichever slides that are of interest, and we will review them throughout the presentation, and hopefully we'll pick out some of the best juicy questions to fire out at our panel who can provide their expert opinions and answer those for you. Finally, we'll just do a very brief wrap-up, a summary of the key points and some take-homes. And just also important to realize that we are recording this, so you'll then be receiving in the coming days a copy via a link that you can then circulate and share to colleagues or anyone who might not have been able to join us today. And that's the synopsis of what we're going to try to achieve today. If I run through to who the APEM Group are, if we go to the next slide, please, Thomas. The APEM Group, I suppose we've been offering our services for over 30 years now, and the APEM Group has grown really from within the UK to being the global player, providing independent environmental consultancy and expert scientific advice, as well as maritime and marine advisory services. And that's really to support the water, the renewables infrastructure, the power utilities, ports and harbours, as well as those regulators and governments to across the world. And from, I suppose, a UK beginning, we now have and offer our services across Europe, across into North America, a wider Southeast Asia. We're looking at South America, and we now have a strong base here in Australia to service the other regions of Australasia and Southeast Asia. We can go to the next slide again, please. So the group itself has grown, as I said, particularly over the last 5 years, as partly through organic growth and partly through acquisition. And we've gone now from just being the APEM Limited to being the APEM Group, and we have various different entities now within that, offering a really broad range of services across the regions that I discussed just now. But more significantly, I suppose that we now be able to advise or provide those additional expertise and capabilities from leading offshore wind farm EIAs through Gobi's expertise, through Nash Maritime, who joined from the navigational risk assessment side of the business, and also more recently we've added partners at Texo and Biosys to strengthen our offering here in Australasia and helping develop a team across many of the different states here in Australia, with it now over 200 people across over 10 different offices across 4 states. If you go to the next slide again, please. And this is just a sort of very sort of brief sort of picture of some of the experience we've had. And a lot of this is from our experience across Europe in terms of that. We've been directly involved in offshore wind farm approvals now for over 50 gigawatts of energy projects from the offshore wind sector across Europe. Globally, we've flown more than collected data from over 1,500 digital aerial surveys, which helps to characterize that marine mammal and seabird baseline data. We've got over 800 staff now across the globe, of which around a quarter of those are now based here in Australia. And we deliver globally for our clients. So that's trying to bring the best of our expertise across all those entities that are now part of the APEM group to provide those services to a mixture of our clients, whether onshore, offshore, or intertidal. So we really are sort of able to sort of continue to provide those different services. And I hope that today, the second of our webinars, you'll be able to get a flavour from Jamie and Brock and the other panel guests about how we relate to the navigational and risk assessment. Briefly, I will just move on to who we have here today. I will let Jamie introduce the panel more than myself, because he knows them a lot more than I do. But we have Jamie Holmes, who's the director from Nash, who joined us a couple of years ago now to the APEM group. We have our Australian colleague, Brock Priest, who some of you will be familiar with from his recent visit here to Melbourne and Sydney. We have a couple of esteemed panel guests through Vaughan Jackson, who's joining us from the Maritime Coast Guard Agency in the UK, as well as Mahesh Alam Chandrani, who's head of navigation, now retired actually, but was head of navigation from the Australian government's Australian Maritime Safety Authority. So we're really pleased to have such a great list of panels. Jamie, I'll just perhaps hand over. Did you want to say a few words intro here?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Sean. I think perhaps it'd be really helpful just for each of the panelists just to give a 30-second overview of background and career and what your role is. So why don't I kick off? So as Sean said, I'm one of the directors and co-founders of Nash Maritime. So we're a specialist shipping and navigation consultancy and joined the group back in APEM group back in summer 23. Personally, I have a background as a maritime civil engineer, and I've spent around 20 years working on design and development of complicated maritime infrastructure projects. And I'll hand over to my colleague, Brock Priest.
Yes, hello all. Brock Priest here. I'm a principal consultant at Nash Maritime and the offshore energy pillar lead, which covers the offshore wind components as well. My background is a naval architect and have about 15 years of experience, mostly in supporting the maritime developments through risk assessments and design support for ports and offshore projects. Might pass on to Jackson, to Vaughan, please.
Yeah, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everybody on the call. Yeah, I'm Vaughan Jackson from the Maritime Coast Guard Agency. I'm the Offshore Renewables Project Lead, a part of the UK Technical Services Navigation. That includes lots of little departments from Hydro and Met through to IMO liaisons and marine licensing, which is the little bit that I'm involved with, and that involves the offshore renewable energy installations. Quick bit of my background. I'm an ex-seafarer. Didn't get up to the heavy heights of captain, so any ex-captains out there, get easy on me, please. But I was at sea for a good 14 years. Know the area which we're going to talk about today. Okay. And that's about it for me for now. So on to Mahesh.
Thanks, Vaughan, and hello, everyone. I'm freshly retired 11 days ago from the Australian Maritime Safety Authority as Head of Navigation and Communications. I was responsible for a team of subject matter experts that looked after the policy and planning aspects of safety of navigation, so everything to do with shiprouting measures, ECTIS, GNSS, aids to navigation, and so forth. On the radio communications side, it was radio communication, GMDSS, and increasingly novel methods of distress alerting and beacon registration. Background-wise, Blackburn, ex-seafarer, spent 15 years out at sea in various capacities, culminating in master, came ashore and then had the honour of being with the Maritime Safety Authority for almost 3 decades. Thanks, everyone. Back to you, Jamie.
Great, thanks very much. Sean, I think over to you for acknowledgement of country.
Thanks, Jim. Yes, so we'd all like to, on behalf of the Airburn Group, just acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where our staff work, our offices are located, and where our projects take place. Particularly the lands, from my own perspective, that I'm fortunate to be working from today. My home office here in Eltham, in the outer northeast of Melbourne, which is home to the Wurundjeri people. So we pay our respects to elders past and present, as well as to all Aboriginal peoples and Torres Strait Islanders. We recognise and celebrate their cultures, traditions and protocols. And with that, I will take a back step and I will pass on the baton back to Jamie. And I really hope everyone here enjoys the presentation and the panel and the summary later on. So thank you very much, and over to you, Jamie.
Great, thanks very much, Sean. Yeah, so Nash Maritime, we're a shipping, navigation and maritime risk consultancy, and we work on complicated maritime infrastructure projects worldwide. This slide calls out our mission. I'm not going to read it out to you because clearly it's on the screen, but just to give you a flavour of sort of who we are, we're quite a broad mix of scientists, risk specialists, analysts, engineers, and we have a core team who've been working together for over 10 years. Most importantly, and I'm always sort of keen to emphasise this, we have quite a few mariners embedded in our team. They may be master mariners, pilots, harbour masters, and this really ensures that we blend the quantitative, analytical, data and evidence-driven basis behind our work with the qualitative expertise from practitioners of what, let's face it, is a complicated environment. So if we just move to the next slide, please, Tom. So just to recap on the agenda of this bit of the webinar. So firstly, my colleague Brock is going to set the scene. So he'll give an overview of why shipping and navigation is such an important consideration through the project lifecycle, and particularly during the early stages where decisions are made that are baked in and harder to revise later on. He'll then talk through what shipping and navigation assessment actually looks like, but we thought it would be useful to do that by characterising shipping and navigation in the Gippsland region, clearly an area of interest to many of us here on the call. So we'll be looking at some of the key navigational features and marine users before highlighting some potential impacts. Brock's then going to hand back to me, and I'll talk about 3 selected impacts. The challenge of coexistence with offshore wind and the maritime environment means there are, of course, many potential impacts, and we clearly don't have time to review and run through the whole range today. Hence why we've picked out 3 key ones. I think these particular ones are probably generally the more challenging to deal with, and so I'll be sharing a few case studies of where things have gone well, but perhaps more interestingly, where things haven't gone so well. Finally, we'll summarise with our 5 key takeaways and top tips, and then we'll move into a panel and Q&A discussion. And I think, Liam, you've just popped a note up showing everybody where to put their questions. So if you have questions, please load them into the Q&A function. We will try and answer them at the end of the session. Great, so if we could just move over to the next slide, and I will hand over to Brock.
Excellent, thanks, Jamie. So as Jamie said, I'm going to take through a little bit about the introduction to shipping and navigation and carry on from there. So about the introduction to shipping and navigation, just go to the next slide, please. So let's starting from the very top. And so what is a shipping navigation assessment? It's an assessment on the impact and the risks to marine users that are associated with a marine development. And that's the risk introduced by the development itself, but also the risk level that's changed by the development and the risk to the development as well. Now, why do we undertake these shipping and navigation assessments? And that's really to understand these risks and the risk mitigations, but the life cycle management of the risks as well, and overall to support the maritime coexistence of the project. And how is this undertaken? And that's done through a structured, informed, and objective assessment process. And that's partly where I'm going to step through a little bit more today as well. Next slide, please. So risk assessments serve a very, very real purpose. And these are just a few snippets from news articles for very relevant risks to offshore wind. The left one shows an incident in February 2022 in which the vessel Julietta D became adrift at an anchorage in heavy weather and contacted a fixed structure at the Kust Zuid wind farm in Dutch waters. The image shows the damage that was left on the wind turbine monopile foundation. Now in the middle, an incident in May 2023 where the vessel Petra L collided with the Gode Wind 1 wind turbine in German waters. And the image here shows the damage sustained by the ship as a result of that contact. And on the right, although this incident wasn't necessarily because of a wind farm infrastructure directly, it's still very relevant because in January 2004, a fishing trawler snagged a fixed object on the seabed, it took on water, and it sank in English waters, involving the loss of the vessel and several fatalities. Now, these risks are among many other impacts considered within the shipping and navigation assessment when evaluating the overall impact the project has on the environment. And it also promotes discussion on the risk mitigations to minimize the risks and impacts, and really promotes safe and sustainable coexistence of all marine users. Next slide, please. There are a whole host of potential impacts which are looked at when doing the shipping and navigation assessment. This simple slide tries to capture a majority of them, covering both fixed and floating wind. Now, reading some of the key ones across from left to right, there are the impacts to nearshore to port and harbour operations. There's impacts to small craft like recreational users or fishing vessels, and the potential squeeze of smaller vessels into busier shipping lanes. There's impacts due to subsea cables and their methods of protection or crossings and the increased risk of vessel grounding because of this. The impact of risk of fishing vessels and anchored vessels snagging subsea cables, or in the event of floating wind farms, the mooring lines or the cable risers themselves as well. There's impacts to search and rescue capability to allow efficient responses to maritime incidents, and impacts to shipping routes and the changes this may bring about to route duration or viability, or route changes altering the risk of collision or contact with a wind turbine, contact with other fixed or floating structures, groundings, or to other users like oil and gas operators. And this also extends to the impacts to availability and optionality for any vessel, for any changes to vessel routing because of adverse weather. Now, there are so many different users and so many independent operators. There's so much potential for local nuances and so much apparent room for interpretation or misinterpretation of information. There are a lot of moving parts to the bigger picture of the broader maritime environment, and a one-size-fits-all approach generally doesn't work. So when are these impacts assessed, and at what point do these considerations become critical? And how can these risks be assessed? And how can we bring confidence to the decision makers that they have been adequately assessed? Next slide, please. So shipping and navigation assessments and navigational risk assessments can be applied at any stage of the project lifecycle. And this effectively applies to any maritime project, not just offshore wind. The NRA becomes the basis of information and a decision support tool and is adaptable to the circumstances or the application. It can be a high level of detail, and it can be qualitative or quantitative. It can provide a record of process and findings, risk responsibility and ownership, or identify gaps. Now, starting from point 1 here, the feasibility and site selection stage can often benefit from an early review of constraints, picking out the bigger issues from the smaller ones and allowing something to be done about them at an early stage, particularly if this involves things around site boundary changes. And point 2 here is the environmental impact assessment and consenting stage, where a more detailed assessment of navigational risks, which are developed through a thorough understanding of the area, involving stakeholder consultation and hazard identification workshops. Now, as we move further around that project lifecycle, we start to see areas in which shipping and navigational risk contribute to a post-consent phases of the project through design refinement, specific turbine siting and safety justification for variances, and to port operations. And navigational safety also leads into the development of maritime safety plans, monitoring, logistics support, and operation-specific risk assessments, all the way through construction, operation maintenance, and final closeout of the project through decommissioning. Go to the next slide, please. Now, in terms of offshore wind in Australia and the stage that is at now, this is primarily the first two, feasibility and site selection, but probably more realistically now, and particularly for the Gippsland area, the environmental impact assessment and consenting stage. Now, we're aware that various consultation activities and work has been undertaken and is ongoing as, in relation to siting of the potential offshore renewable areas as a whole as well. Next slide, please. So taking into a little bit more sort of site selection and more specifically around risk assessments and how they're undertaken. Next slide, please. Now, I'm not going to dive into the regulatory framework, but just going to keep simply to navigational safety and the shipping navigation with respect to offshore wind developments. To that extent, the Australian Maritime Safety Authority, AMSA's policy on offshore renewable energy infrastructure, for the most part, follows the UK Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, the MCA's, well-worn, tried and tested Marine Guidance Note MGN 654 on safety of navigation for offshore renewable energy installations and guidance on navigational practice, safety, and emergency response. These documents effectively outline the requirements for consideration when assessing a navigational safety and emergency rescue for an offshore wind farm, including the cumulative effects of other projects. Its guidance is applicable throughout all stages of assessment, from site selection or refinement through to post-consent monitoring and management, and it also sets expectations and navigation risk assessment methodology, key impacts, stakeholder groups, on-site vessel traffic survey requirements, array area siting to routes, and the lines of orientation for structures, among numerous other things. Now, as Jamie said earlier, we had introductions from Mahesh and Vaughan. We're also very fortunate enough to have both Vaughan from the MCA and Mahesh, who's recently retired from the AMSA, to share some insights in the panel discussion a little bit later as well. Next slide, please. Now, the navigational risk assessment itself is at the heart of the shipping and navigation chapter of an environmental impact assessment. It effectively unpacks the current and future scenarios throughout the construction, the operation and maintenance, and the decommissioning phases of the project, and it uses data, knowledge, and experience gathered from a wide variety of sources, including key user groups, documents, and data sets. The methodology for a navigational risk assessment recommended by MGN 654 and by virtue AMSA's policy on offshore renewables follows the International Maritime Organization, the IMO's, formal safety assessment process. This consists of 5 core steps. Step 1 is the hazard identification through a combination of consultation, baseline understanding of the navigational profile, including vessel traffic analysis, and incident analysis, and data gathering. Step 2 is to assess the risk, likelihood, and consequence, and to score or rank the risk using a structured, understandable, and transparent approach. Steps 3 and 4 are to review and assess the risk controls to reach a level that is as low as reasonably practicable, or a LARP. Now, all the steps so far have key stakeholder involvement, aiming to achieve consensus and being proactive about safe and sustainable future coexistence with the project. And step 5 rounds this out with recommendations that are appropriate for decision making. The steps form a structured framework to a navigation risk assessment. However, the level of detail can be tapered higher or lower depending on the overall purpose. If we think back to the previous slide, we had grouped early stages as feasibility and site selection. This phase of the life cycle may not need as thorough or an extensive navigation risk assessment as in a higher level red, amber, green approach, traffic light approach to constraints identification might be more appropriate and might meet the needs to inform early decisions in identifying early key concerns. Next slide, please. Taking a look at the Gippsland area as an example and identifying some of the navigational features. So looking at the area around the 12 feasibility licensed sites, we have 2 traffic separation schemes. There's an area to be avoided around oil and gas infrastructure. There's the oil and gas infrastructure itself, both in clusters and isolated. There's various navigational hazards in the form of islands in the Bass Strait and existing aids to navigation marking those islands and entrances to ports. There's the key ports dotted around Victoria and Tasmania as well, and the subsea infrastructure, both oil and gas and subsea cables. Now, it's a busy area, and it's filled with various other shipping and navigation considerations, together with other nationally, culturally, and environmentally sensitive areas. Traffic separation schemes are effectively the highways of the sea and define the traffic flow in that area, and the area to be avoided for larger vessels near oil and gas infrastructure, as well as the oil and gas infrastructure itself and various islands, all contribute to navigational risks. Existing aids to navigation, their sight lines and visibility in and around lit wind turbines, together with adverse weather and poor visibility, are all aspects to be considered and can all start to be considered at an early stage of the project to start answering the questions of what's important, what's a consenting risk, what do we need to look into further, and who needs to be consulted. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to take you through a simple example of just one area of an assessment. Now, looking at the vessel traffic data and distilling that down to something usable, understandable, and identifying where impacts may exist. Now, ultimately, the nature of impacts identified will warrant more or less detailed investigation depending on the severity or magnitude of that impact. But for now, let's take the Gippsland area again, shown here extending across the southern coast of Victoria, Bass Strait, and the northern coast of Tasmania. Now, the plot on the left shows historical vessel tracks derived from AIS, automatic identification, AIS data transmissions. Now, AIS transponders are required on most commercial vessels, but not all vessels are required to carry it. There are therefore some gaps in the extent of coverage of this data for some user groups, and I'll get onto this in a moment. For now, though, this AIS data is from AMSIS Spatial Data and Australian Marine Spatial Information System, AMSIS. From this, the vessel density can be assessed, and we start to build our understanding on vessel routing and the amount of vessel traffic, shown in the plot on the right with blue showing the routes with the greatest traffic density. Next slide, please. This data can be broken down to look at vessel tracks by type and to drill further into better understanding the usage in the area. Similar reviews can be done for other types of vessels like tug and service vessels, cargo vessels, tankers, etc., or anchoring areas or loitering areas, or just to explore possible nuanced behaviors and anomalies in the data. As I mentioned before, not all vessels are required to carry AIS, and so can be underrepresented by AIS data alone. These are particularly the recreational craft and smaller fishing vessels. I mentioned vessel traffic surveys earlier. In the UK, the MGN 654 guidance requires 2 seasonally representative vessel traffic surveys to support the navigation risk assessment. That's one 14-day summer survey and one 14-day winter survey. These help build a better picture about the overall usage of the area around the wind farm structures, as well as pick up on any unknowns that might show up. We've coordinated dozens of these around the UK, and they would typically involve chartering a local vessel of the right specs to be stationed on site using a combination of our equipment, the ship's equipment, and the ship's crew to collect and record AIS, radar, and visual observations for all vessels and watercraft within a range that covers the site boundary plus about 10 nautical mile buffer. Because these surveys are needed to support the NRA and the consultation that goes with it, they generally need to be organised relatively early on and have a 2-year validity period before the application is submitted. Okay, next slide, please. So taking a look at how things might actually change. And this is purely a simple example of an impact identification process and is not trying to comment on the significance of any particular impact. But we have a snapshot of historical AIS data for passenger vessels. On the left, we see all vessels marked as passenger vessels in magenta. And these would be the likes of ferries or cruise vessels, tour boats, etc. And on the right, the vessel tracks that pass through a wind farm boundary are shown in thin yellow lines. Taking, for example, those that pass through Gippsland Skies or Coot Wood may then have route changes with possible options shown as the thick yellow dashed lines. Any changes can then give rise to other knock-on effects, like meeting other traffic in different areas, crossing other traffic routes in different areas, or additional journey time that affects and the various effects that goes with that as well. Okay, next slide, please. And then there's how these can be further analysed. So, for example, through qualitative and quantitative risk modelling, to look at the likelihood increase and decrease on routes or at crossings. before the wind farm, both before the wind farm and the base case scenario, and after the wind farm, the future case scenario. Other analysis tools like gate analysis can be applied to drill into specific traffic and disruption across across the section to assess how ships navigate within their routes and to help define base case route widths. You can see this on the right-hand plot as a gate analysis done across the southernmost traffic separation scheme in the Gippsland area. Now, overall, the risk assessment and the wider analysis tools provides the project with an objective and informed assessment, but it also provides clarity to stakeholders that help answer the questions: what is the risk and to whom that applies, and how it compares to present-day risk levels, and is it actually significant? Most importantly, what the potential risk controls are, and that might be more suited to mitigating those particular risks. Next slide, please. Now, I've spoken a few times about the importance of stakeholder engagement throughout the project. The likes of the Maritime Safety Authority, Department of Defence, industry bodies, fishing stakeholders, recreational user groups, local port authorities, and other relevant commercial stakeholders like oil and gas or ferry operators. Engagement is particularly important to ensure their qualitative contributions can be brought together with the quantitative data analysis. These not only help to inform the assessments themselves, but also to jointly discuss the risks, to reach a consensus on risk scoring and potential risk control options if they're needed. These all form critical parts of a hazard workshop, which is shown here on the image on the left, which was taken from the support of navigation risk assessment of an offshore wind farm in the UK. Stakeholders can be engaged to help assess risks and mitigations through ship simulations, like on the right here, to simulate new future scenarios like new routes or collision avoidance and the ability to achieve it. In this particular case, we brought ferry company mariners into a simulated environment. It can be a large investment at the outset, but it can equally bring extremely high value in removing subjectivity to an assessment and is the next best thing to actual real-world trials when it might be a bit too late. Next slide, please.
And that's back to me. Thanks very much, Brock. So here's a case study of where it didn't go so well, and that you should recognise. This is the southeast corner of the UK here. So we've got the Thames estuary, with the approaches to London, and the Dover Straits between England and France, just in the bottom right. It's a really complex and busy area with prescribed routes in and out of major ports. You've got shallow waters, existing wind farms. And if you look just in the bottom right of all these purple blobs there, you'll see the existing 300 megawatt Thanet wind farm. And there's a little red ring around it, which represents a proposed 340 megawatt extension. Now, in 2020, the DCO, a Development Consent Order application for this extension, was actually refused by the UK Secretary of State. And that was on the basis of it being judged to cause an unsafe impact to the safety of navigation and causing unacceptable commercial impacts to a major UK port. The lesson here was twofold. Firstly, the need to do site selection and risk assessment properly and early. This could have been mitigated through design revision of what that red ring looked like at quite an early stage, but the design had been fixed by that point, and navigation, it was too late to consider navigation in greater detail. The second learning here is about ensuring that consultation is effective, and on the slide here, that last point there, the examining authority and the Navigation Safety Authority here in the UK, the Maritime Coast Guard Agency, place significant weight and credence to the views of stakeholders, particularly those mariners who had local experience and rightly a very strong collective voice. So if you just move to the next slide. So we're now going to talk through the three key topics, and the first here is about designing your site for effective risk management and safe operations. Next slide, please, Tom. So we're talking about design today, throughout the presentation, and classically we think about the shape, the location, the shape, and the boundaries. But shipping navigation risk is also about your long-term safety management system. How is that offshore wind farm going to be operated safely in the long term, from construction through operation and maintenance and into decommissioning. So there's some plans listed here, which I think probably appear fairly standard and self-explanatory, but are useful to define at a really early stage, at least in an outline form, because some of the components of these plans will need to be incorporated into design and therefore considered from a risk reduction perspective. So if I just pluck out one or two, vessel traffic management plan, understanding what your marine operational concept is through construction and into operation. How will you manage the wide-ranging types of vessels and consider their interactions between themselves, but also third parties? Do you need to develop protocols or routing protocols? Aids to navigation, how the wind farm will be marked and lit. Will it be peripheral structures or boundary ones? Will you be using raycons, AAS repeaters? And lastly, how is the wind farm designed so that you can plan for pollution incidents and respond to emergencies in the area of the project? Next slide, please. So talking of emergencies, it's right to dwell on search and rescue. And search and rescue is not just about reducing the consequence of an incident, but it actually has a really big bearing right up front on the design, shape and layout of your wind farm. And when we talk about search and rescue, we think in terms of aviation and maritime assets. Search and rescue's biggest influence on design is probably in lines of orientation and linearity between all the turbines, where predictability and regularity are the key watchwords for the feasibility of search and rescue assets, being able to enter an array area and safely conduct operations. There might be many pressures on where you put individual turbines, but this needs to be carefully balanced. And in the UK, we've got a very strong history of having two lines of orientation, effectively a gridded pattern, and a very strong safety case justification has been needed when to deviate from that. Lastly, I've written technical, and you'll see in this image, for example, imagine if you're a helicopter pilot flying down the line of a set of turbines in a wind farm. All these turbines are aligned in their position, but they have different orientation and they're in different states of rotation. During an incident, a developer might ask, a Coast Guard might ask a developer that all the blades are orientated together to enhance the fly-through lane, and all the blades are locked in position, in the same position. So one of them is, for example, called bunny ears, where you have the two blades like that. Next slide, please. Impacts and interface with ports and harbours. This really is a topic in itself, and one I'm quite passionate about. Ports are clearly critical to the whole life cycle of a wind farm, and as that's where they're often built and serviced from. The relationship is even more critical in floating offshore wind, where for commercial scale projects, the requirements on a port can be really onerous. And the top image here shows the proposed Port Talbot in the UK Celtic Sea. And you can see a range of semi-submersible floating offshore wind platforms at various stages of fabrication and assembly. Now, just bear in mind that each one of these semi-submersibles could be 90 by 90 meters in footprint and 10 to 15 meters of draft. And when you consider that a commercial scale 1 gigawatt offshore wind farm could have 60 of these being fabricated and installed over a 1 to 2 year season, you can start to appreciate that the area required, both landside and on the water, is really significant, and not all ports are capable of taking this. As you move into the water, you can see semi-subs being stored with and without topsides. You need deep water to do that, and you need an adequately sized navigation channel for towage out the port and onto site. And towage itself brings additional considerations. Next slide, please. So I talked earlier about Thanet extension being judged as the wrong side of acceptable in terms of impact to a port. And I think it's worth highlighting again the importance of safeguarding access to ports and minimising impacts on their own existing operations. But it is likely that aside from having to coexist, a floating wind port will require redevelopment. I talked about Port Talbot, and on this image here, you can see the Port of Nigg here in Scotland, which is fabricating floating semi-subs. These are both ports that are significantly repurposing, but interestingly, the process of redeveloping a port is actually often proves to be one of the critical parts in the programme of any wind farm project. Finally, many ports will be their own statutory function for navigation safety. They'll have their own underlying risk assessment and approach to managing risk, and it'll need extensive review and update to safely incorporate this quite significant change in operations and user type into the port environment and the underlying risk assessment. I'll now move on to talk about cumulative impacts. Next slide again, please, there, Thomas. So cumulative and in combination issues are increasingly becoming the exam question in UK offshore wind, as we've got increasing multiple developments in the same sea area. Multiple projects in close proximity can create first, second, and third order effects on ship routing. And the crux is that cumulatively, when you're considering multiple projects, impacts will exist which wouldn't exist were there only to be one offshore wind farm. And many seabed owners and governments will consider cumulative aspects holistically within marine spatial planning, and I suspect Mahesh will talk to this point later. But there is still a requirement for individual projects to consider and address that cumulative picture. And that really isn't easy, because you as an individual project don't necessarily have foresight of what the other individual projects are going to end up looking like. So here in the Gippsland area, you can see all classic interactions that are cumulative. So we've got cumulative deviation of routes. You've got the creation of a corridor here between Star of the South and Gippsland 2. And you've got spatial squeeze, where deviated routes are now converging differently. And that's obviously made slightly more interesting, where we've got a traffic separation scheme at the top right of the inset there. So what we're seeing increasingly these days is projects taking a very regional approach to their assessment. And if we just move to the next slide, I'd like to talk you through a case study from the Eastern Irish Sea in the UK. So we're on west coast of North England. I think this is a really interesting example of a regional approach to assessments, and it's an area that the team here at Nash have been working on for about 5 years. There's a number of existing and proposed wind farms. So all the existing wind farms here are in purple, and I think a green one there. And if you just click again there, Thomas, we can see a series of proposed wind farms, and these wind farms here are from the 2022 leasing round 4 projects. So there are 3 yellow ones there and some additional orange ones which are from different effectively leasing processes. It's a really complex area of navigation. We've got numerous ports, we've got commercial and key ferry routes, and we've got fishing, recreational activity, oil and gas platforms. The ferry routes in particular are absolutely critical in connecting islands. So we've got the Isle of Man in the middle of the screen there, but we've also got Northern Ireland and Ireland off to the left-hand side of the screen, and they've got key routes between England and Scotland. So you can quite clearly see that when you overlay these projects, there's the potential for impact to the routes. The approach to this assessment has been a bit of an industry first in terms of leading from a cumulative approach and also the level of collaboration between the developers. So I'd like to talk you through the journey on this, putting together some of the points above and showing the evolution of the projects. So if we just move to the next slide, Tom, and there's going to be quite a lot of clicking. So as I said, back in 2019, we started work in this area. And if you click now, please, and we were commissioned to undertake a weighted constraint overlay analysis. So we looked at all the different receptors from shipping navigation perspective, considering their significance and producing a heat map of influence. And this helped the developer understand potentially developable and undevelopable areas and I guess everything in between that they could consider with all the other factors that influence the project. If you could click again there, please, Tom. So in 2022, as I said on the previous slide, 3 developers were successful in winning 3 options for lease on these areas here. Next click. Now, some of the initial shipping and navigation studies quite swiftly led to a design change, and you can, the eagle-eyed amongst you will see that there's now a gap between the 2 left-hand projects, and that's primarily to facilitate the passage of the ferry routes that you can see on this heat map here. And next click. So we did extensive work on these routes, trying to really understand how the ferries operate. So here you can see 2 key routes between the Isle of Man and England. And it's not just that there's a regular set of tracks. We actually identified that there was some different routing they would take in adverse weather, and you can see some of the tracks down to the southwest. Really important to be able to maintain the ability for those routes to be feasible in adverse weather conditions. Next one, we then ran navigation simulation modeling, and next one again, we did bridge simulation, as Brock talked about earlier. So we had mariners from all the ferry operators in the simulated environment trying to understand the feasibility of navigating in the area. We ran into hazard workshops, as you can see there on the screen there, and this concluded that there were still unacceptable risks with the design mitigation. So we made revisions to the project. If you can click again. So you can see we've removed the red area and the array areas for all 3 projects have been collectively revised to that shown in grey. And that was primarily to increase sea room in the areas between the projects, both the proposed and the existing, to allow safe transit, reduce the likelihood of potential traffic encounters, and also minimise the deviation distance. We then, if you could just click again, we repeated that whole process through analysis, modelling, simulation. Click again, please. Yeah, so we went through that whole process again, and if you click again, yeah, the EIA was submitted earlier this year, and in the bottom right there, you can see some of my colleagues who are currently in the middle of the examination phase, which in the UK is a 6-month process exploring have the impacts been correctly identified and appropriately mitigated to policy. So this project is really complicated. It's very much a live one, and we'll be seeing decisions from the Secretary of State over the next 18 months or so. So if we just click again, I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to talk relatively swiftly through our sort of key takeaways. Next slide there, Tom. So number 1 is consider shipping and navigation. I've got 5 key recommendations here. Consider shipping and navigation issues early. They really do have a bearing on your site location and layout, so this is worth understanding. Secondly, engage with stakeholders in a meaningful way. They will give you really excellent insight into how they operate, most importantly, why they do that, and they will help you qualify the level of risk and potential impact. I would really encourage bringing those third parties inside your studies, really integrating them into the work. And in fact, I'd say to not do so gives you some risk. Thirdly, be site specific in your assessments. By the very nature of shipping and navigation, there just really is no one size fits all. By all means, use guidance and industry precedents to inform boundaries and layouts, but I think it's important to remain open-minded to having to consider the nuances of any particular location. And fourthly, use NRAs to inform decision making. I think this talks to the first point, but by doing these studies early, you have the opportunity to underpin the design decisions you do with a robust evidence base, and you're doing so whilst you've still got time to do it. Ultimately, that will help de-risk your consent. And fifth, engage with specialists. Now, I mean local area knowledge and shipping and navigation consultants. Now, clearly I would say that because I'm a shipping and navigation consultant, but more seriously, that they will give you early insight and advice, drawing on learnings from across the world, particularly where it hasn't gone so well, and And if engaged early, you can carry that advice through your early design and environmental studies, and not be making changes later, which will be more problematic. So there we go. That takes us through the meat of the presentation. So that's I appreciate we've covered quite a lot of ground there. That moves us into the panel section. So I guess probably the sensible way to kick off is perhaps in turn I'd ask Mahesh and Vaughan to offer a general view from their perspectives, and without picking on anyone, I am going to pick on someone and ask Mahesh. Perhaps you'd like to offer us a little bit of 2 or 3 minutes of your insight.
Thanks, Jamie. And look, there won't be any surprise to say that we pretty much align with everything that you've said. The other caveat before I offer a few comments is that all that I say should not be attributed to AMSA. I'm just speaking in a personal capacity. For those that are not aware, we had a change of federal government in May 22, and very soon there were 6 areas released for prospective developers to come up with a feasibility license application. And again, no surprises, they were off population centers, off Port Kembla, Newcastle. You've touched on the Gippsland one, Jamie, off the north coast of Tassie, Portland, and then off Bunbury in WA. As far as I know, 5 of the 6 areas have been released. The 6th may have been done in the 2 weeks that I've been away. I'm not aware. But the key point over there, the 2 key points over there, one is the close collaboration between AMSA, which was doing this first pass safety assessment, not so much a formal assessment, but safety advice to start with, to shape that feasibility area. And the other thing that we noticed when I was at AMSA was the number of submissions that came in from the public, if you like. Typically an area had 14,000 submissions, and what was remarkable was about half of them, or more than half of them, were about visual impact. So you'll see that the areas are typically 20 kilometers offshore, if not more. We have the luxury of sea room, obviously, here. But again, as you get into deeper water, the challenges get heightened. I guess that was the other thing. One of the things we're grappling with, we as in the government's grappling with, is if we have floating infrastructure, can it be considered a ship, or is it considered something else? And therefore, what act will apply to the design, construction, pollution, that sort of aspect? And again, the jury's out on that. We haven't landed at a spot as yet. In Australia, for those that are not aware, we have something called the Offshore Constitutional Settlement of 1979. So we have this division of responsibility between the states and the Commonwealth, and there's certain powers and certain rights, if you like, that states enjoy from the low water mark out to 3 nautical miles, and then beyond that is Commonwealth waters, so to speak. That's quite different to UNCLOS. This is a very uniquely Australian thing, if you like. You touched on it, Jamie, but getting early, we've, I think, foreshadowed to at least 2 of the developers that taking IMO adopted shiprouting measures through the IMO is a long, lengthy process, and equally, once set, it's pretty hard to chop and change. These things have long lead times. Understandably, that's just the way IMO is structured and the way the IMO works. Another comment that I have is marine spatial planning, and we were quite inspired by the UK's Marine Management Office and the enabling legislation that you guys had way back in, I don't know, 2010 or 2012 somewhere. I'd like to see some of that framework here in Australia for all the reasons that you sort of touched on, Jamie. And there's the Blue Economy CRC standing for Cooperative Research Centre. That's part of the Griffith University. That's on the cusp of finalising a framework which they will present to government. And I'm hoping the government will adopt that and turn that into a sort of government thing, if you like, which developers and other users of the common water space can use. And finally, very quickly, just conscious of time, Jamie, is you talked about hazard workshops and quantitative assessment, etc. There are a couple of ILM models which I'm sure you're aware of. The first one being POSA, the Ports and Waterways Safety Assessment, which is really a Delphi method of converting opinion into numbers and having it follows the ISO 31000 and the IMO's FSA process. So I'd encourage people to have a look at that if that's of interest. And then you touched on it, Jamie. There's the IALA's IRAP model, which is really a computer program, if you like, to predict the probability of collisions and groundings. There's a lot that we can talk about. Obviously, we can drill into each of these separately, but I'll leave it at that. And thanks, Jamie.
No, thank you. And I think that last point is really interesting, drawing attention to the IALA toolbox. And there has been, historically there have been, and this isn't a sort of shipping and navigation specific point, but there have been lots of people using sort of black box models. And one of the advantages of the IALA models, IRAP in particular, is that it is effectively an IALA tool. It's not black box. It's open and it's structured, and PORSA has been a particularly strong way of bringing appropriate weighting to stakeholders in hazard workshops. Understandably, there can be emotive issues, but you can often end up marginalising those who have big issues, but perhaps not necessarily a strong voice. And PORSA,
but I think the model allows for that because it weights the opinion of experts.
Yeah. Thank you. And Vaughan, do you have any comments? I'm conscious we're rather limited on time, but
yeah, I think that's been very thorough run through of everything that we would consider, everything that needs to be thought about, with a few uniquely Australian aspects thrown in there that I've been learning from today. So it's been really good to listen in on that. But I say that the main three things that we would start with would be not obstructing or protecting, if you like, IMO routing measures that already exist. To ensure that those following on routes, historical or lifeline routes, as we call them in the UK, remain open. So if you see that on the tracks that were that you showed earlier, there's just a definite, well-used, well-run route there that might not be on the chart as a ferry route, but it's clearly a historic route that should be protected and should avoid being blocked. And then finally, of course, lead on from that, ports and the access to and from. Again, very important that that's maintained. Now in the UK, we do have a little bit of a, I'll just grab that, sorry. We do have a little bit of an advantage, but I think Mahesh mentioned there that we do have a national policy statement in which we do have shipping and navigation as part of that to be protected. So we can always fall back on that when it comes to planning. And any developer that kind of pushes back, we can always say, well, did you check the statement? And oh, okay. But yeah, it's there, it's all available, and anybody looking to start would go for it. But yeah, just to reiterate very quickly what you said, early engagement, very important, and get as much information as you possibly can before that application, or an important application. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Vaughan. Yeah, that's been really interesting. I had a few. I can see there's a few sort of topics that are interesting to people in terms of talking about evolving guidance and autonomous vessels and novel fuels. But I think we've run out of time to touch on that. Perhaps that could be a topic of another webinar down the line. I think I probably better hand over to Sean. I think Sean, you were going to talk to what happens next and the next webinar, etc.
Thanks, Jamie. That's really fantastic to hear all that from yourself and Brock and from the panel guests as well. And yeah, unfortunately we've run out of time to go into further depth. But I can see there are lots of questions that have been sent in by attendees from wherever you come from, wherever that topic is. So just to let you know, we will take all those questions away, and the team and the panel here will review those and get back to you. And provide those back to you. You'll also get a link back to the whole recording, which is really useful for anyone who maybe had to dive out or arrived late, or maybe had colleagues or friends or other clients that you can then pass this on to who had an interest. Just a quick mention, we did the webinar earlier in the year, which was focused on the sort of marine wildlife survey and our digital aerial capabilities for seabirds, marine mammals, and other marine wildlife. Jamie and Brock here in the panel have just run today's, this evening's, if you like, and we do have some more to look out for into Q1 and Q2 next year, where we'll be delivering. We'll have Ross Culloch, who's over at the moment in Perth, attending the Marine Mammal Symposium, the biannual conference over there on marine mammals, and he'll be giving a talk about marine mammals and how that plays out in terms of impact assessment process for offshore wind and the challenges of the baseline data collection that we have here for the difference of different species that we have and the scale of those animals. We'll then have a further discussion, hopefully around April next year, which will be focusing on the cumulative and other impact assessment challenges that are going to be unique to Australia. And I know, thank you, Jenny, for touching on the cumulative effects in terms of the NRA side of things here. Really, we are looking to then take that through Q3, Q4 for other technical leads, and as and when we're developing our projects here. We really, really appreciate everybody's time today for joining. If there are any further questions, please please reach out to Jamie, myself, others. We're all on LinkedIn, we're all on email. Just communicate back to us. We really look forward to helping further support the Australian, New Zealand, and other Southeast Asia areas to help develop offshore wind here and help take that energy transition to renewable energies. So yes, thank you, Jamie. Thank you, everybody else, for joining. I think that's probably about wrapped up. We can just go to the final slide there. Obviously, there is the APEM Group website there, the Australian APEM Group website there. Do have a look at that if you'd like to look at any of the other wider services and capabilities, and do get in touch. So yes, without further ado, thank you very much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks all.
Bye now.
Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.